Hello everyone, welcome to IBA and Norton Rose Fulbright's Masterclass, where we'll be discussing repossessions and remarketing of aircraft. Phil Seymour here, Company President at IBA. Thanks for joining us today. We have a new format today for our webinars. This will allow you to request more information about our products and services, plus we've added a lot of useful guides, including those such as a very neat repossession infographic, a guide to transition management and aircraft storage, plus the usual ability to submit questions. I'm joined today by our Director of Asset Management and Technical, Peter Walter, and by Robin Springthorpe, a partner at Norton Rose Fulbright. A brief intro in terms of Robin. Robin is a litigation and disputes resolution lawyer based in London. He focuses on disputes in the aviation industry. He's conducted some of the largest and most significant aviation cases in the sector, advising on aircraft and engine leasing, financing and redelivery disputes, particularly those involving technical issues, disputes with airframe, engine and component OEMs under purchase contracts, including those in relation to future deliveries and claims under warranties, commercial disputes against a wide variety of contractual counterparties, such as MROs, engine shops, airports, fuel suppliers. It's a very long list, put it this way. We've had the pleasure of working with Robin, especially on some of those technical aspects where technical expertise and valuations are required. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we do have a lot of interesting subjects to be discussing. We've got the key industry trends, risk levels in the current climate, contingency planning, defaults and termination rights, notices and lease termination formalities, recovering assets, records and maintaining asset value, avoiding unwanted repossession costs and the remarketing opportunities, and of course, lease renegotiations. So before we start, just a quick reminder that we provide a range of data intelligence products and services to support the industry, which we've been doing through the aviation cycle for 33 years, from our Insight IQ data products, valuations, advisory and analytics, through to technical and asset management. If you're not familiar with asset management services, we're one of the most experienced teams in the market, supporting clients at the beginning, throughout and at the end of the leasing cycle, providing fleet selection guidance through aircraft management and the redeliveries, and we have in-depth knowledge of managing aircraft operating leases from the initial assessment through to negotiations and the unfortunate situations of repossessions and the remarketing. So in particular, I want to mention our Insight IQ. It's our one-stop aviation intelligence platform. We recognize the importance of both comprehensive and accurate data, and we go through a very detailed quality assurance process to make sure every entry is updated correctly. Our data stems from over 65 years of proprietary data, which we combine with third-party sources and our award-winning valuations to create the leading aviation data platform. So we continue to innovate and combine more data, news and analysis and insight with technology to provide clarity and solutions to meet your company's ambitions. We've recently added more macroeconomic data and events, historic values, and especially pleased for you to take a look at our CO2 or carbon emissions calculator. If you're not yet familiar with these products, we can now provide emission outputs at the aircraft MSN level, as well as across routes, aircraft types and organisations to support your green obligations to finance or for your stakeholders. If you'd like to find out more about our intelligence product, please get in touch using the Insight IQ form on the console. And I'm now looking forward to getting through the main content. We've got 20 plus slides to get through today. Rather than wait until the end to address your questions, we will have an informal or chatty style as I interact with Pete and Robin throughout the session. We do have questions that you sent ahead of the session, so thanks for that. And we'll either respond directly or we've included the responses in the slide deck. We'll also be taking more questions through the webinar, so please do send them over via the questions box on the console. And we've got a couple of polling questions to keep you engaged in this deck. So in terms of this, a quick view of where we are now. This slide is really looking at passenger flight utilizations, and we've looked at them on the left-hand side in terms of regions of the world. The central graph is looking at the type of aircraft, and the one on the right is looking at the role of the aircraft. very generally speaking, they are heading in the right direction if we look at where we were in March and April of 2020. However, there are some interesting takeaways from this slide. On the left-hand side, the region of the world, I suppose the standout here is this sluggish recovery of Europe and CIS. And for those of you who are in this sort of European sector, you'll know that we've still got significant restrictions. I know the EU has announced some alleviation, especially the travel to the US. So hopefully we'll see some improvement in the next month or so. But meanwhile, the UK with the Delta variant is proving to be a problem area. Question we've had before on this, the Asia Pacific, which is the sort of lilac colour line at the top. There is usually a drop down during the beginning of the calendar year, or rather the Chinese New Year. So that is usually expected. In terms of the centre graph, in terms of type of aircraft, it's probably no surprise that the darker blue line, wide bodies, are sort of further behind than any other sector. And that, of course, is due to the restrictions on international long-haul travel. In terms of the role of the aircraft, again, I think this is the evidence that the freighters and the corporate sectors are probably doing better as a result of the sluggishness in the let's say the lighter blue at the bottom, the passenger aircraft utilisation. The other thing is the orange line shows the so-called quick change aircraft. We did see a rise in that last year. A lot of those aircraft have now sort of moved into the freighter role rather than being the quick change role. So that accounts for that drop-off. In terms of our review, the slide we call Airline Failures and Restructuring. Again, just a reminder, historically, we see a strong correlation between the oil price and airline failures. Obviously, fuel price is one of the largest direct operating costs that an airline faces. But obviously, this time around with the pandemic, there's a real dislocation. I mean, this time last year, it didn't really matter how cheap fuel was. We just couldn't fly. But we do expect to see some more direct correlation in the coming years as hopefully we move onwards and upwards. But an interesting slide here is that, how is it unfolding during this year compared to last year? And really, if we look at the total 2020 split, so that's the large blue and red bar under the 2020 total, it really signifies that there's still a huge amount of aircraft which were subject to restructuring. And I'm not sure we've got the full answers on all of those restructurings yet. And more recently, we've continued to see issues, and we've seen a recent one over here with Stobart Air announcing that they would no longer be operating. So clearly don't appear to be out of the woods yet. However, let's look at some of the good news. We've seen quite a number of startup airlines being announced. We've counted over 130 that have said they will be operational during 2021 and 2022. Looking at that breakdown, the pie chart on the lower left by location, it might seem surprising, at least it did to me, that Europe accounts for almost half, or 40% of these startup airlines, especially against the backdrop that I mentioned earlier in terms of the unknowns that we still face in this region. But I think some of that is partly to do with the national carriers really looking at their own networks and cutting back. Some of the established low-cost carriers deciding to move away from some bases has opened up opportunities for others. And of course, there are still opportunities, I would say, in that low-cost long-haul sector, which does appear to be the focus for many of these startup carriers. And that probably is why we're seeing, if we look across on the right-hand side, the families being considered by startup airlines. Although it's probably a statement of the obvious that A320s and 737s, the most liquid short to medium haul aircraft. We're seeing the A330s being in the market, so many of them available. There are some great opportunities for startup carriers who perhaps were looking at the business pre-COVID, where there was already good opportunities to get some relatively low-cost wide-body assets. And of course, that has just become an even greater opportunity with lowering of lease rates. At this point, I would like to bring up the first of our polling questions. And it's very simple. It's fairly straightforward. So please have a look at this. In general, do you think we've seen the last of the airline failures and or restructuring, or we've not yet seen the full fallout of the pandemic? So if you'd like to press on either 1 or 2, and let's see how that goes. I can see. I want to encourage you to have a look at that. It's the numbers of you who are clicking on the buttons appears to be rising. So I'm just going to give you another few more seconds, and then I will move on to, let's just have a look at the results of that. Yeah, I don't know if I led you into this conclusion that we've not yet seen the full fallout of the pandemic. I still think there's some way to go, and I think most of you who decided to take part in this poll probably agree that we are still looking at tough times. We've had a lot of government support, in particular for national carriers. There's a lot of debt that's been taken on, and I think there's still a long way to go, especially as we need to see how the macroeconomic issues such as fuel price, interest rates, etc., affect the costs of some of these new airlines that are coming along. So thanks for taking part in that. At this point, I want to hand you over to Pete. I will hand over control to you, Pete.
Okay, thank you. So what we're just looking at here is the timeline as an example of a restructuring of Chapter 11. If you look at the boxes to the left, I'll try not to spend too long on it. There is sort of the pre-petition and preparation for a company filing, and during this time, it's really when financiers and lessors should be taking note that their aircraft are not flying, and you need to start doing something about it. There is trouble ahead, and preparation, as they say, a stitch in time is worth 9. You're getting some inspections done, get the records in order, and see where you are in terms of what may or may not be happening. You've then got the overall timeline, by the way, that we're looking at here from left to right can be anything really from 2 to 3 years, because once companies are in a Chapter 11 process, you normally have a year or so of pre-petition and filing and stabilisation, and during this point there will be negotiations with the airline to understand what their plans are, what they're doing. There may well be what they're effectively trying to do is take control of the company and see if there is an opportunity to restructure by rejecting certain aircraft leases, certain contracts, restructuring the whole cost base, and there will be a negotiation that goes through in that process. That's why we're saying that there's a renegotiation proposals and RFPs, and there's obviously Robin can speak in much more detail as to the court process that goes on behind that. The intention of this slide was really to say what can you be doing as an aircraft owner, lessor, or indeed financier to try and look at what may come out at the other end in order to put yourself in the best position. So an awful lot of contingency planning then is happening as you get. It's an ongoing process and negotiation with the airline to understand what's happening, but you should be starting to give some consideration to possible aircraft rejections or abandonments. As I mentioned before, get your records, understand what engines are on your aircraft, where your engines are, possibly consider the appointment of a third-party camo in order to maintain the airworthiness certificate of the aircraft. and it's not on here, but from a legal perspective, you may also need to consider establishing a suitable vehicle to take title to the aircraft. Once the aircraft is rejected and comes out of an airline, if it's a financed asset where they have title to it, you need to consider what you're going to do with that title. And then aircraft recovery, actually taking physical possession and control of the aircraft. And then once you work your way through the court approval, and there's just above this line where it says remarketing, there's a plan formulation and confirmation element where you have those 4 arrows all sitting up. You will have some aircraft being rejected during the process ahead of this, and then you get to the final plan for exit from Chapter 11, at which point the final go-forward leases or restructured debt proposals will be finalised, and then the airline will have a set plan for its fleet going forward in respect of it. And the court has to approve that. They had to say that this is a viable business going forward with the new business plan that has been reviewed and considered, and indeed consented to by those parties that are supporting it going forward. So I've tried not to linger on this too long. I know there's a lot in this slide. There should be a few more, a bit more with the hours. But Robin, will you have anything else that you want to add in terms of Chapter 11? We could probably do a whole seminar purely on Chapter 11. In the initial thoughts, in terms of comments.
Nothing else from me, Peter, at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, just to hurry up, Pete, you had the slide that you'll receive. Everyone will get a copy of this slide deck in the next, well, I say the next day. The slide that we can see on the preview is complete, so I think it's just a presentation problem. And just to clarify, the arrows that are pointing upwards sort of create a timeline, don't they, Pete, from the start of the process to the exit. And as you've said, that could take perhaps as short as 6 months, but perhaps as long as 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. So Robin, I think the next slide is yours. You have control.
Thank you very much, Phil. So hello everyone. Just looking at lessors' options in the event of a default. We're actually seeing the COVID crisis has been quite different from previous disruptive issues. So in the past, lessors have been quicker to consider terminating the leasing of the aircraft and taking repossession and remarketing. And this in the past has been because extracting the asset and the documents was key to preserving the asset and indeed the revenue stream. And debt claims used to be quite secondary and were often not pursued at all, often because the prospects for any serious recovery were low and everyone's looking more towards the future. But now, with the obvious difficulties of remarketing aircraft and the lower lease rates, this is causing lessors to take a slightly different view. So we're seeing keep aircraft on their existing leases, which obviously are relatively good deals, rather than taking aircraft back and having to incur the cost and the risk of remarketing. So instead, lessors are agreeing workouts, so typically rent holidays and deferrals in return, perhaps for clearing some of the arrears or an extension of the term, and often also strengthening other terms. So, for instance, enhancing or adding to information requirements or non-discrimination or requesting additional security. And of course, lessors are also looking at other measures such as supplying security deposits and demanding replenishment of those, or even grounding of aircraft where they're entitled to do so. But at the moment, we're seeing that repossession generally is a last resort. And it's most often used where an aircraft is perhaps in danger of being caught up in some local insolvency regime, where the aircraft isn't being looked after properly, or where there is really no prospect of the current lessee ever recovering and ever making payments. So as a result, we're actually seeing fewer repossessions and actually more court proceedings by lessors who are suing airlines. So they're keeping the leases current, but they're suing for the arrears of rent and maintenance reserves. And I think the reasons for this actually can be quite compelling. First of all, it's relatively cheap. It's a relatively quick summary judgment process, which in English courts could take perhaps 2 to 4 months from start to finish, with the airlines having to bear the costs. It gives you an enforceable judgment, which gets the attention of under pressure airline executives. It can help jump the queue when scarce funds actually do become available. And the threat of disrupting operations by enforcing a judgment or even threatening a forced bankruptcy can help achieve payment in advance of those who don't take any action. So we are actually seeing a several-fold increase in court claims or rental and maintenance reserve debts, and frankly we expect to see this continue. Airlines are still struggling. Recovery is patchy, as Phil has indicated already. It's precisely when airlines are going to be able to generate revenues will depend upon the success of vaccination programs and government actions and indeed consumer confidence. And some airlines have already reached the end of deferral periods, but are still not generating revenues forecast, and so are immediately going back into arrears and breaching the deferral. So we're expecting that pattern to continue.
Looking at the key areas for contingency planning, there are a number of elements that you need to understand, because the approach that you take to your contingency planning will vary depending on the circumstance you're faced with. So number one, is it a friendly jurisdiction? Is it a friendly airline that is saying, yes, we recognise we can't afford to keep this aircraft and therefore they will be cooperative? Or is it a hostile situation, both in terms of dealing with the airline and indeed, is it a hostile jurisdiction? We've seen this in the past in India with Jet Airways, and indeed going back another 10 years or so. Prior to that, there's been a number of insolvencies, and that's where you need to engage the likes of Norton Rose to actually get a court order to enforce your position. So assuming that everything is, you're still talking to the airline and they recognise that they can't take the aircraft, there are a few things that you need to look at. Access to the aircraft and the records is number one and fundamental to it. Understanding the maintenance status and the routes that your aircraft is operating on is important, because you might actually consent to then continuing to operate the aircraft to get it into a more friendly jurisdiction, or flying it to a location that would work for you. Quite often what happens is the aircraft simply get grounded by the airline at their base, and therefore you need to find a way to repossess that aircraft in future, and quite often it will be at your cost. We've seen this with LATAM and Avianca. They are cooperative in that, saying that they will fly the aircraft to a location of your choice, but you will have to pay for it as owner financier. So understanding where that is going. The other key issue is, and one that we spend a lot of time on, is actually titled components. Engines are one of the most significant, particularly when you're looking at used aircraft. The majority if you've got a narrow body aircraft and anything above 8 to 9 years, the majority of the value is going to be in the engines. So if your engines are on someone else's aircraft and you've got somebody else's engines, then working that through is critical. So planning in advance and cooperation with other owners is important. There is some people will have what's called a RORA, a recognition of rights agreement, and that can be used to assist with regards to the exchange of engines. In fact, what a RORA does is mean that you don't actually physically change the engines, you just agree to exchange the value differential depending on the maintenance status of the aircraft. You don't necessarily always want to do that though, because the engine that's on your aircraft might have an issue with boroscopes, and you say, actually, Despite the value, I prefer to have my titled engine back. So if you've got an unserviceable aircraft, it's on the ground, parts have been robbed. That is another key feature that tends to happen when airlines are getting into financial difficulty. They can't necessarily secure all the parts that are required to keep their aircraft operational, the few aircraft that they are operating. And so spare parts will be taken, borrowed, shall we say, from other aircraft that are parked and on the ground. So, of course, once key components come off, your aircraft is no longer serviceable. So you need to be able to understand what condition they're in. You need people on the ground monitoring your aircraft, actually maintaining a robbed parts list so that you can work out what needs to be done to make sure your aircraft is serviceable, to be able to, even if you just have a special flight permit for a single flight, to get your aircraft to a location of choice where you want to store it. Other elements are understanding where you are going to store your aircraft in due course. Does that location have the necessary MRO capabilities to do work on your aircraft? For instance, you don't want to just park it in the desert and there's no one around, because then any work you have to do on that aircraft, you're going to have to bus people in or fly people in with the necessary equipment and tools to get your aircraft operational. Plus, you've got to house them whilst they're there. So understanding the location of where you're going to place the aircraft is key. And we've seen, storage locations around the world, as you might expect, have been filling up. We've seen additional investment from companies. APAS, for instance, in Australia, have been spending a lot of money increasing the storage area simply to cater for more aircraft on the ground. And then the third element here is the aircraft records. And again, clearly you can't sell your aircraft, you can't lease your aircraft if you don't have the records. And it is something you really must do long ahead of the aircraft coming out. Really start, I can't stress how important it is to get your aircraft records in order ahead of taking the aircraft out. Similarly, when an airline starts to get into financial difficulty, you might find that there are no record staff available anymore. They've been made redundant, or they're really down to a skeletal staff. So if you think there are problems, then get your records scanned. It's relatively cheap compared to, if you spend $10,000–$15,000 having your records scanned. Compare that to the cost of and the value of your aircraft. So that's a quick snapshot of some of the work you can do in terms of contingency planning and storage, and it relates back to the Chapter 11 slide that we had in terms of some of the work you can be doing in preparation to avoid further cost down the line, when the aircraft is actually ejected. So okay. That's kind of just wrapping it up for me, Phil, in terms of a quick snapshot of contingency planning.
Yep, thanks, Pete. I'll move on to the next slide.
So when exercising rights, I have a checklist of things to do, which I'm very happy to circulate to people, but it was quite tedious, so I've moved away from that. So I'll just run through some of the things I would do if I were looking at exercising rights. So first of all, obviously reading the lease carefully and abiding by it, and if your lease is well drafted, it will give you plenty of robust remedies. It's important not to overstep those rights, which could complicate and delay matters. But you obviously have to follow the contractual pre-requirements for exercising remedies. That means serving any notices required to create an event of default. Of course, for rental arrears, it's normally automatic once the grace period passes, but notice is normally required for other breaches. You've obviously then got to allow any grace periods, and then serving further notices required prior to actual exercise of the remedies. And I always think that, as well as following the formal notice provisions carefully, it's also sensible to give informal notice by all the other means that are open to you. But when dealing with defaulting airlines, you need to be robust. I think it's right to give a reasonable time for compliance. But then if you don't get compliance, then you move promptly on to the next step. You need to show that you mean business. You need to show that the pressure is going to increase into a sort of crescendo, and you need to get the attention of the airline's management. You need to get that attention and keep it. If you lose it, then you will find that the airline will go off and deal with other more pressing creditors. Information is often key to making decisions. Some airlines have been quite good at providing their lessors with information and business plans. Most are not that good, and some are deliberately opaque. I think you should avoid making decisions without proper information, and indeed avoid being picked off individually. In some cases, it makes sense to talk to other lessors. You might consider in cases where there's a sort of significant airline with a lot of interested lessors, you might consider creating a creditor committee composed of lessors who own a decent proportion of the airline's leased fleet. And this may give greater leverage over the airline and avoid the sort of divide and rule, and establish better lines of communication and better information. You can consider requiring an airline to get access to advice from suitable consultants to restructure their operations so that the airline is successful in the future. And of course, if repossession is a possibility, as I say, there's a sort of, as well as the practical checklist that Peter's just gone through, there's a number of legal steps which I can circulate generally. The only thing I would just want to talk about here quickly was getting good local counsel involved. So jurisdictional issues are key on repossession, and knowing the lie of the land locally, particularly regarding recognition and enforcement of judgments and other practical matters, informs what is the best approach. It's usually relatively simple and quick to obtain an order from the competent court for delivery up of the aircraft, as we call it in England. So normally in London, if we got instructions today, we would normally expect to get an order before the end of the week. But the value of such an order may depend on the extent to which it is enforceable in wherever the asset is located. So I think choosing your local lawyers who can advise on, as I say, self-help. There are not that many jurisdictions around the world where self-help is permitted, and frankly, even where it is, there are often good reasons for getting court orders anyway. But it's worth knowing. And actually, just on that, and a delegate has asked whether we do use self-help as well as court orders, and the answer is yes, we do. The next thing to check with your local lawyer is whether orders from your court are enforceable in the jurisdiction where the asset is located. You also need to check whether there are other orders that can be obtained in the local courts, not only for recognition or for the competent court's order, but local injunctions or orders for preservation of the assets and its documents. You need what steps can be taken to ensure you get access to the aircraft and records. You need to check what steps are needed to deregister the aircraft through the local court or the local registry, and will the registry honour an order of the competent court. And you also need to see how quickly these things can be done. I had a conversation once with a lawyer in another jurisdiction who assured me that he could get orders from the court very quickly, and it turned out that was between 9 and 12 months, which was not quick enough. So people have different, but it is important. I mean, it's your aircraft life that is being used up. It may be grounded without being put on a proper storage program. It might be being used as a Christmas tree. So, very important. I think that my other final tip is, above all, don't assume that the repossession and deregistration in the local jurisdiction will be as simple as you have been advised in the opinion letters that you obtained on leasing the aircraft. It is almost always much more complicated in practice.
Thanks, Robin. You've got another slide on liens now.
Yeah, shall I move straight on to that? So just a few liens. as an ever more frequent issue on airline defaults and failures, and actually we find that lessors and financiers are often unaware of the risks and the complications for repossession and maintaining the value of your asset. So liens are important because they give rights to the lien holder which are superior even to the owner's rights and the rights of secured financiers. Air navigation systems like Eurocontrol, local CAA, airport operators and tax authorities often have a priority, and they have a priority over both contractual liens and possessory liens that may be imposed by MROs and engine shops. All of those have priority over mortgages and ownership rights. You may be aware that in the UK, the CAA has the right to detain aircraft not only in respect of charges for the aircraft in question, and then that's not just charges that were incurred by the person who is the operator at the time of the detention, but also charges incurred by other aircraft in the same fleet at the time of the detention, the so-called fleet lien. So that in the UK it can magnify even further. There are ways around that. We need to be aware that there can be some significant problems. Liens can also be created in relation to EU ETS and CORSIA regimes. As regards MROs and engine shops, these normally have well-drafted contracts which contain fulsome liens, and these contractual liens are usually more extensive and give the MROs more protection than just a mere possessory lien, which arises just simply because they've done work on the aircraft or the engine. So liens need to be considered because they can delay and actually can considerably make more expensive the repossession of aircraft, and actually potentially give the right to a third party to sell your aircraft amount which you would consider to be far too low. So that's all I had on liens, unless there are any questions.
Once you have your aircraft out, or even with the airline's consent, you can start remarketing activity ahead of that. You obviously want to start looking at what you want to do with that aircraft in order to recover the value or maximise the recovery of your value. So there are a number of options, and most importantly, I think, is to understand that the possible future use of your aircraft. So, for instance, you'll see there's a couple of 777s that IBA is marketing on behalf of a client. They're ex-Virgin. So we are exploring a number of different options. One is operating them as passenger aircraft. Two is operating them as freighters, where it's cargo in the passenger compartment. Or lastly, actually an interest in converting them to freighters on a complete basis. So we need to understand the possible role of the aircraft. Similarly, the 330s that we have there, again, we're marketing a couple of ex-Thai A330s. These would make excellent freighters, and there is a fair amount of interest that's coming in for it. The helicopter there, which I'm glad to say is now sold, one of our aircraft that we were working on for some time, really suffered difficulties with the North Sea and the crash in oil price. So the lease rates for these types of helicopters and the demand really went down. So we could have redeployed this aircraft as search and rescue. As it happened, there was a recovery in demand for oil and gas transportation of people going up to the rigs, and so having stored the aircraft and maintained it for some time, we were now able to sell it. So understanding where the aircraft is going to be used will obviously dictate the process that you go through. There is also a last process that I would mention, and that's auction. And I think when you're auctioning an aircraft, it should really be, in my personal view, possibly the last resort. Parts can be sold by auction on a reasonable basis, and some ancillary and ground support equipment. But generally speaking, I would not recommend to a client that you go to auction. In fact, there is a very significant legal case that's ongoing at the moment where bondholders are accusing the agent in one of the Nordic aviation structures of going to auction unnecessarily. And I think the situation there was that the agents felt that so long as they didn't do anything wrong, they couldn't be sued, and they were just following the process in the documentation. But it seems that if people don't agree that that was the best outcome, they're challenging that. And so I'm not going to get too deep into it because it's a current legal case, and there is people far better qualified than myself. So you can just flicking down the bullet points on the left-hand side, maybe leave the aircraft with the current lessee. Really look at renegotiating the terms. Could they perhaps sublease the aircraft to another area of the world where there is demand for your aircraft type? One of the real problems that we've seen with COVID is just the global reduction in traffic has meant that it's not really worthwhile repossessing an aircraft, because even if you repossess it, there isn't demand for it elsewhere. In previous downturns, we've seen this on a regional basis. If you wind the clock back 10, 15 years, there was problems in America, but there was still, a fair amount of activity in Asia and the Pacific region. So an outright sale or disposal, just selling it to a new investor, or maybe selling it to an airline. Lease placement with a new operator, taking the aircraft out and finding someone else who will operate it, or just sitting on it for a while. Park the aircraft, wait for the market to recover. If you are repossessing it, then of course you would need to pick up the cost of storage, maintenance, and insurance. And then lastly, conversion to freighter. Now again, you need to be cognizant of the future demand for freighters, the cost associated with freighter conversion, but that is an increasing option. We are seeing retirement of older freighter types, so a number of aircraft that you would not previously have considered for freighters are now being lined up. So instead of being converted to freighter at maybe 18, 20 years, you're now looking at freighter conversions younger, maybe 14 to 15 years, depending on the type. The A321 is going to be coming in to compete with the 757, and again, I think we'll be seeing 330s really competing for the old 767s, which have largely been used as freighters. So some thoughts there around remarketing options and what you need to do, but fundamentally is understanding the possible role of your aircraft before you look at it. And then, of course, lastly, you have the part out. A lot of value is driven out from the engines, and when you're looking at a part out strategy, you need to understand again the value of the LLPs in the engines. You don't necessarily want to green time your engines. That means lease your engines out to be operated on their own on another aircraft. Sometimes you could actually destroy value because you will burn off the remaining life in the LLPs, so that when you actually scrap the engine, there's no value left in the LLPs. So you need to do an evaluation of what is the lease rental income for the remaining green time compared to the remaining flight cycles on the LLPs. And again, the airframe, tear that down. There are thousands of components, but what we are seeing is that as more and more aircraft get parked and torn down, the world inventory of stock that is on the shelf waiting to be used is getting bigger and bigger. So you could take off some components and they sit on the shelf for maybe previously 18 months. They now may sit on the shelf for 2 or 3 years waiting to be used. So the number of valuable components that you can take off an airframe that is worthwhile having recertified or tagged serviceable as removed becomes less and less, because the timeline for those to be utilised or sold or operated is getting longer. So you do need some real special advice on how to approach that element of an exit strategy on an aircraft.
So thanks, Pete. This is some info from our Insight IQ, looking at historical lease rates of a couple of the most popular narrow bodies, the A320 and the 737-800. And I think what's interesting here is if these lines are the sort of what I would call the constant age lease rates. So I think we've seen in previous downturns that actually lease rates, and this is a very general statement, lease rates have recovered on the most liquid types to a reasonable level. Now, of course, if we look at these curves on the left-hand side for both the A320 and the 737, over the last year, obviously we've seen the lease rates, whether it's a new aircraft or whether it's a 15-year-old one, basically dropping. The issue here is, will they recover? I mean, I think the expectation is they will, particularly on the newer versions of some of these aircraft. But the A320s here are the CEO versions, not the NEOs. And likewise, these are the classic 737-800s. So I suppose they are at an age now where really we're probably looking at those aircraft lease rates probably less likely to recover as they did when they were a much younger aircraft type. And to pick up a couple of wide bodies, clearly a lot of focus is on the A330s and the 777-300s. Historically, those lease rates were quite sort of resilient through the global financial crisis, because actually a lot of those wide body aircraft were subject to much longer term leases. So there wasn't a great deal of renegotiation going on. But where there was a dip, and you can see a slight dip there in A330s in the January 2009 to 2010 period, they did actually recover. But of course, they have been on a slow journey down, not necessarily COVID related. We've seen some excess supply in both of these aircraft types in the last couple of years, so they were already on the way down. I think the next slide, Pete, this was coming back to doing the deal, but we are a bit short of time. I don't know if there's any, I suppose, takeaways here rather than going through each one of the points. Is it a case that there's not a general answer, that there's no size fits all? Each one of these transactions is going to be specific to between the lessor and the lessee? I think you're on mute, Pete.
Right. Yeah, I was just saying that if we're a bit short on time, then people come to these in their own, read through these in their own time. There are all sorts of different nuances how deals are done and how they're structured. Is a price fixed? Is it subject to further due diligence? What's the timing? What's the exclusivity period? And this is to be fair to both purchaser and seller. If people want to chat about this in due course, please pick up the phone.
Yeah, and I think this is, I know the focus on this maybe seems quite negative when we're talking about repossessions and remarketing, but actually, we have seen recessions before. We know this is, not a great period, but as we've seen, there are a lot of startup airlines out there as well, lots of new opportunities. So I think we will start to see, some uplift perhaps. I think just to the next slide, Robin, this was really, this could be a seminar or webinar all on its own. I don't know if you just want to speak to this for a couple of minutes, but I think this was along the lines of, even pre-COVID, we'd seen some industry issues such as long-term grounding of a new type of aircraft. I mean, that was never really contemplated. I know we'd seen some delivery issues in the past with the A380 program, the 787 program, but obviously grounding of the Maxes was unprecedented. And then COVID came along, which was yet another unprecedented situation. So I suppose I was looking at this from if I was an airline and I'm looking at a lease today, I'm going to start asking for, there needs to be some recognition that there may be another pandemic, there may be another grounding, there may be an airworthiness directive that, it may not be the aircraft, it may be the engine. So, where do we go on this sort of situation?
Yeah, Phil, and I don't think lessors are going to particularly like to hear that the absolute obligation, the hell and high water obligation, might be in any way sort of watered down. But you can see that there might be a case for it in some kinds of issues. As you say, the 737 MAX is a good example where it's not the fault of the airline. You can sort of see it might be more difficult to draw the line where perhaps it's an engine issue. I think probably where there's a pandemic, or something which affects a particular jurisdiction, which prevents the airline from generating revenues, it's going to be harder for an airline to argue it. In terms of what might be put in its place, I suppose you might think that in defined circumstances, you might have a power by the hour, you might have some agreement that perhaps allows an airline to reduce its liquidity issues in defined circumstances. For instance, making a scheme of arrangement or a company voluntary arrangement permissible rather than treating them as events of default. You might even have some form of agreement that a rent will be reduced in defined circumstances. And that's, after all, not entirely novel when you think that for some airlines with sort of seasonal operations, they have seasonally adjusted rates. So I think it's worth thinking that this may well form part of negotiations going forward. It may well be that better airline credits will begin to insist on these kind of provisions, and indeed actually agreeing them will make it easier for lessors to place aircraft with those good credits. You might find even that lessors can command a higher rental if they agree such provisions, which could be particularly useful when the market is weak. So I think it's on the agenda. I'm not saying that anyone has to agree it, but I think it is going to form part of negotiations going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it would definitely be on my agenda with my airline hat on. In any case, we've had a few. We've had several questions which I'll come to. I just want to run through the sort of the key takeaways that we still think there's a significant amount of uncertainty remaining. Only 6 weeks ago we were talking about such huge pent-up demand that it would drive a massive recovery in the Northern Hemisphere summer season. But despite the great progress with vaccines, we're still seeing a lot of concern over the new variants. So the improvement in utilisation seems to be quite regionalised at the moment. We're still seeing pressure. We were talking to IATA yesterday. There's still a lot of concern generally about the health of airlines' finances. Freighter, of course, have seen utilisation increase and demand is pretty high in that sector. We're still seeing, a lot of forbearance. We're still seeing banks and lessors, and governments supporting, but a lot of that is directed towards what I would call the better credits, the national carriers. And I still think there's some way to go for some of the regional carriers. I would say as well, we have focused on the lessor community here. We're seeing lots of other issues in that whole supply chain, MRO contracts, perhaps where there's been long-term support agreements based on minimum utilizations that were probably never envisaged that aircraft wouldn't actually be flying. So still a lot of things to be sorted out in the sector. In terms of Q&A, we've had quite a few what I would call really quite detailed legal questions, and I think we'll get those off to Robin to respond to you individually on some of those. Robin, I've got a very general question. Has Cape Town worked? In half a minute, do you think Cape Town has been useful in this particular period?
Well, I think I have to be slightly diplomatic here because my firm is one of those who's strong proponent of Cape Town. But I think it has a lot of virtues. I think the only thing I'd say is that I haven't seen it be that effective or that helpful when it actually comes to repossessions. And part of the reason for that is that local courts often will not really recognise it, and it takes a while to get them to do so. So I think there are occasions when it's been helpful. I think the pressure on the courts and the government have been useful, but I think it's quite hard to look at sort of specific examples where it's made all the difference.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. We did have a question about one of the slides I was showing earlier, and let me just see if I can get that back up on the screen. I think it was relating to the sectors and what's sort of happening out there, and I think the question was really around this middle graph in terms of the turboprop and it looks like turboprops and to some extent regional jets are not actually improving in an upward direction. I think this does bring up a very interesting situation. I did allude to this in the takeaways that a lot of government support has been focused on the national carriers. The regional airlines have really struggled, I think, to capture what I would call government support because it is more regionalised. It may not be as particularly relevant with the headlines. And I think that has meant that many regional operators have been less well supported, which is really, it is counterintuitive because I've also said that domestic travel has been more robust than international travel. But I think when I'm talking about domestic there, the way that I are to talk about domestic, it's US domestic. It may not be UK domestic or UK and Ireland domestic. Because clearly here we had the pre-COVID failure of Flybe and we've had Stobart Air collapsing in the last few days. So I do understand the question was, well, hang on, we're hearing about regional travel being more robust. But I just think that generally speaking, those airlines are less well funded. The shareholders may not have as deep pockets as an access to capital that some of the larger airlines have. So I think that's why we still see issues in that regional sector. A very general question, Robin, was around operating leases. And a very general question is, does English law dominate on operating leases or not? And if not, what are the other jurisdictions or laws that are used in operating leases?
Yeah, I mean, I think the principal ones are English and New York. Those I think would be the normal ones. Others are used from time to time, but I'd say those are the dominant ones. Okay,
good. Well, we've overrun by a couple of minutes there. If I didn't get round to answering your questions specifically in this session, then please do bear with us. We'll get back to you on an individual basis. I think as far as sorry, we had a few technical issues there. Hopefully we'll get those cleaned up for the next time we use this platform. So just to remind you that we're using data from our online data intelligence platform, Insight IQ. We're offering demonstrations, so do drop us a line and get back to us with the Insight IQ form or via the feedback form if you'd like to take a look at the system. Or just to find out a few more details. We've had a few questions around the 130 startup airlines. Please do ask us questions on those if you need a bit more detail. And of course, fundamentally, this is all about asset management, whether how often you're managing your aircraft, how frequently you looked at it before the pandemic. The emphasis has to be long-term management, not just getting stuck in when there's a problem. But thanks to you all for attending today's session. You will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to view a recording of today's session and the slide deck. So on behalf of IBA and Norton Rose Fulbright, thanks for joining us today. Special thanks to our marketing team who've organised us to present the event today. Goodbye.